Imagine unfolding a piece of gazelle skin parchment, aged and fragile, its edges irregular, its surface covered in vivid pigments that have somehow survived 5 centuries of wars and relocations and human indifference. The colours are still there, blues and greens and reds, and as your eyes adjust to the detail, you begin to trace coastlines. You recognise some of them immediately. There is the Atlantic, broad and blue. There is the western coast of Africa, curving down toward the south. There are the islands of the Caribbean, rendered with surprising care. And then, as you follow the map further, something stops you cold. Because at the bottom, curving away from the known world, there is land. A vast sweeping landmass reaching along the southern edge of the map where, by any conventional understanding, there should be nothing but open ocean for thousands of miles before you reach anything solid. And a question forms. Slowly at first, then with increasing urgency. What is that? This is the Piri Reis map, drawn in 1513 by an Ottoman admiral named Piri Reis, rediscovered in an Istanbul palace in 1929, and quietly sitting at the centre of one of history's most stubborn cartographic mysteries ever since. It is not a forgery. It is not a rumour or a legend or a story passed down through generations until the original facts became unrecognisable. It is a real physical object, authenticated, studied, debated and housed today in the Topkapi Palace Museum in Istanbul. You can look at photographs of it. Scholars have written extensively about it. And yet the questions it raises do not go away quietly. Some of those questions are relatively straightforward, even if the answers remain elusive. Where did Piri Reis get his source material? He was a naval officer, not an explorer, working from a desk in the Ottoman Empire at a time when the great voyages of Columbus and Vespucci were still recent history. The maps he would have had access to were a patchwork, some accurate, some wildly distorted, some based on first-hand observation, and others on rumour and guesswork. Yet something in the way certain coastlines are rendered suggests access to information that went beyond what was commonly available. Or does it? That is precisely the kind of question this map forces you to sit with. Other questions are considerably more dramatic and considerably more contested. Starting in the mid-20th century, certain researchers began arguing that the southern landmass on the map was not merely a cartographic convention or a misplaced guess, that it was in fact an accurate depiction of Antarctica, a continent that was not officially discovered until 1820. If that were true, it would mean someone, somewhere, had knowledge of a continent 3 centuries before European explorers ever laid eyes on it. And some went further still, suggesting the accuracy was so precise, it implied the map was derived from ancient sources, perhaps predating recorded history, from a civilization that surveyed the earth from the air, or possessed navigational technology we have no record of. Those are extraordinary claims, and extraordinary claims deserve something more than enthusiasm. They deserve scrutiny, context, and a willingness to follow the evidence wherever it actually leads, even when that destination is less exciting than the starting point. That is exactly what this video intends to do. We are going to walk through the history of Piri Reis himself, because the man who made this map was genuinely fascinating long before the map became controversial. We are going to examine how it was made, what it was made from, and which sources Piri Reis himself acknowledged using, because he left notes, and those notes matter enormously. We are going to look carefully at what the map actually depicts, section by section, without letting the most sensational interpretation crowd out the more careful one. We are going to take the Antarctica Claim seriously enough to investigate it properly, trace where it came from, and look at what cartographers and historians actually think when they examine it with professional eyes. And we are going to explore the stranger corners of this story, the missing pieces, the distortions, the projections, and the inconvenient details that cut both ways, complicating the mainstream narrative just as readily as they complicate the fringe one. There is something genuinely mysterious about this map. That is not promotional language designed to keep you watching. It is a straightforward observation. A fragment of a 1513 world map made by an Ottoman sailor, drawing on sources that included recently captured Spanish charts, shows features that are difficult to explain cleanly, that prompted serious academic debate in the 20th century, and that still generate more questions than comfortable answers. You do not have to believe in lost civilizations or alien cartographers to find that interesting. The map is interesting on its own terms, in its own historical moment, as a window into how knowledge travelled in the early 16th century and what happened to it along the way. So here is where we begin, not with answers, but with the map itself, sprawling across gazelle skin, 5 centuries old, its coastline still vivid, its mysteries still open. Before we go any further, though, welcome back to Kingdoms at Night. If you are listening from a quiet room, a late train, a dark bedroom, or somewhere halfway across the world, pause for a moment and drop a comment. Tell me what time it is where you are right now, and where in the world you're watching from. Imagine the room where it is first unfolded again. Dust in the air, soft museum light, a sheet of old skin lying flat on a table, its lines older than almost every country now printed in a modern atlas. Someone leans closer, follows the Atlantic with one finger, and realizes the map is not only showing places, it is showing the movement of knowledge itself. Let's talk about Piri Reis. His full name was Haji Muhyiddin Piri ibn Haji Mehmed, and he was born sometime around 1470, probably in the Aegean port city of Gallipoli, a place that smelled of salt and pitch and rope, where the business of the sea was not a romantic abstraction, but a daily practical, occasionally brutal fact of life. He grew up watching galleys being fitted and provisioned. He grew up listening to pilots argue about currents and winds and the shifting sandbars at harbour mouths. By the time he was old enough to be useful on a deck, the sea was already less a destination than a native element, the place where life made the most sense, and where a man with the right combination of skill and nerve could build something lasting. His uncle was a man named Kemal Reis, and that connection shaped everything. Kemal Reis was one of the Ottoman Empire's most accomplished corsairs, a navigator and raider of considerable reputation who operated across the western Mediterranean at a time when the line between piracy and naval service was drawn mostly in pencil, easily smudged depending on who needed what. Piri went to sea with his uncle as a young man, probably in his teens, and spent the better part of 2 decades in that world, the world of fast galleys, contested coastlines, rapid intelligence gathering, and the constant need to know exactly where you were and where the shoals were, and how quickly you could reach safe harbour if things went badly. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it shapes how we should think about the map. Piri Reis was not a philosopher or a theorist. He was not drawing abstract pictures of a world he had read about in books. He was a working mariner who understood that incorrect information on a chart was not an intellectual embarrassment, it was a death sentence. The difference between a headland correctly placed and one mislocated by 20 miles could be the difference between a ship arriving safely and a ship breaking open on rocks in the dark. That kind of professional relationship with geographic accuracy leaves marks on the way a person thinks about maps, the way they evaluate sources, the way they weigh one piece of information against another. By the early 1500s, Piri had transitioned from corsair to naval officer in the service of the Ottoman Sultan, and the Ottoman Empire at that moment was one of the most powerful, sophisticated, and geographically ambitious states in the world. Istanbul, Constantinople, renamed and reimagined after its conquest in 1453, sat at the hinge between Europe and Asia, between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, between overland trade routes and maritime ones. The Ottomans were deeply, practically interested in geography, not as a scholarly pursuit, but as a strategic necessity. They needed to know where their enemies were, where their trade routes ran, where their fleets could operate, and where the margins of the known world were shifting as new information arrived from the Atlantic voyages that had been redefining European understanding of the globe since the 1490s. The Mediterranean of the early 16th century was a place of extraordinary informational density and equally extraordinary informational chaos. Knowledge moved through it like rumour fast, transforming as it travelled, sometimes accurate and sometimes wildly wrong by the time it arrived at its destination. A pilot who had sailed the Barbary coast 3 times had knowledge that no library in Europe possessed. A captured Spanish sailor might have seen charts that had never been copied, never been shared beyond a small circle of Iberian navigators working under the explicit instruction of the Spanish crown to keep their geographic discoveries secret. An Ottoman merchant who traded out of Alexandria might have heard, second-hand, third-hand, about the shape of a coastline on the far side of an ocean nobody in Istanbul had yet sailed. Piri Reis moved through this world constantly collecting. That is perhaps the most important thing to understand about him. He was a compiler as much as he was a sailor, a man who grasped that the value of geographic knowledge multiplied when it was organized, compared, and recorded. At some point, probably over a period of years rather than in a single sustained effort, he began working on a document he would eventually call the Kitab-i the Book of Navigation, a comprehensive guide to the Mediterranean that combined his own observations, pilot accounts, and existing charts into something genuinely useful for practical navigation. The Piri Reis map of 1513, the fragment we are concerned with, came from the same impulse applied to the larger question of what the world looked like now that Columbus had returned from the west and Cabral had touched the coast of Brazil, and the outlines of continents were being redrawn with a speed that left everyone slightly breathless. And here is the geographic reality that surrounded the making of that map. By 1513, the broad existence of the Americas was understood in the courts and harbours of Europe, if not yet fully processed. Amerigo Vespucci had written his influential accounts of the South American coast. The name America itself had been applied to the New World on Waldsee Muller's famous map of 1507, just 6 years before Piri drew his. News of Cabral's 1500 landing in Brazil had circulated through Lisbon and spread from there. Columbus himself had made 4 voyages, reaching islands, coasts, and river mouths that he interpreted with varying degrees of accuracy. The Caribbean was becoming, slowly, a known geography, even if the full shape of the continents to its north and south remained speculative. But this knowledge was not evenly distributed. The Portuguese were ferociously protective of their Atlantic charts. The Spanish were not much more generous. The maps that captured the most current geographic intelligence were not public documents. They were strategic assets, guarded, restricted, known only to pilots who had actually made the voyages and to the officials in Lisbon and Seville who commissioned and controlled them. Getting access to that information, if you were an Ottoman naval officer, required something other than a library card. What it required was exactly the kind of situation the early 16th century produced in abundance. Prisoners, captures, exchanges, defections, the movement of people across political and religious boundaries in ways that carried knowledge with them, whether anyone intended it or not. Sailors who had sailed with Columbus and been captured at sea. Pilots who had worked for the Spanish crown and ended up in circumstances where what they knew had a different kind of value than it had before. Maps that were copied quickly, imperfectly, by people working under pressure with limited materials and no way to verify everything they were transcribing. Piri Reis gathered all of this. He was, by his own account and by everything we can reconstruct about his methods, a voracious and methodical accumulator of geographic information deeply skeptical of any single source, and deeply aware that sources disagreed with each other in ways that required judgment to navigate. He understood that the map he was making was not the final word. It was a synthesis, a best current understanding, assembled from materials of wildly varying quality and provenance. That understanding of his own situation is, in a strange way, what makes the map so interesting and so difficult to interpret cleanly, because a man who knows his sources are imperfect will try to reconcile them, and reconciliation introduces distortions that look, from a distance, like errors or, if you're inclined that way, like evidence of something hidden. A coastline that ends up in the wrong place is not necessarily a mystery. It might be the result of two conflicting charts being averaged, or a misidentified landmark, or a degree of longitude that was off because 16th century instruments were not equal to the problem. Understanding Piri Reis means holding two things simultaneously: genuine admiration for the sophistication of what he was attempting, and clear-eyed recognition that he was working at the edge of what his era could verify. He was not a fraud. He was not transcribing something handed down from ancient gods or undiscovered civilizations. He was a skilled, serious, intensely practical man, doing something extremely difficult with the tools available to him in Istanbul in the second decade of the 16th century. And he was doing it in a world that was changing faster than any map could fully capture. A world where the coastlines of continents were being reported by sailors who sometimes saw them clearly and sometimes barely at all, where the difference between what was known and what was guessed was not always visible to the person doing the guessing, and where the sheer velocity of new information arriving from the Atlantic meant that any map you finished drawing was already, in some respects, out of date. That is the world the Piri Reis map came from. Not a world of impossible knowledge preserved across millennia, but a world of imperfect, urgent, magnificently complicated human knowledge, circulating through the harbours and palaces and prison ships of the early 16th century, leaving its marks on a piece of gazelle skin that has outlasted almost everyone who ever handled it. That map needed to be made. Piri Reis needed to make it. And the way he made it tells us more about what it contains than almost anything else we could examine. To understand what Piri Reis actually produced, you have to understand the tradition he was working inside, because the Piri Reis map of 1513 did not emerge from nowhere, and it was not invented from scratch. It was built on a specific, highly developed cartographic tradition that had been evolving in Mediterranean workshops for roughly 2 centuries before he picked up his pen. A tradition with its own conventions, its own priorities, its own particular genius, and its own particular blind spots. That tradition was the Portolan chart. And if you have never encountered one, the experience of looking at a good example for the first time is genuinely arresting. You expect something primitive, crude coastlines, vague interiors, the confident wrongness of someone guessing at shapes they have never seen. What you get instead is something that looks almost modern in its precision, along the coasts that mattered to the people who made it. The Mediterranean shoreline on a 14th century Portolan chart is startlingly accurate, rendered with a confidence and detail that reflects not theory but accumulated observation. Pilots who had sailed those waters hundreds of times, who knew where the headlands were and where the currents pulled, and where the water went shallow in ways that could kill you if you forgot. The word Portolan comes from the Italian portolano, meaning a written sailing guide, a practical document describing harbours and hazards and distances. The charts that took on that name were the visual counterpart. Dense, practical, sailor-focused objects that told you what you needed to know to move a ship safely from one port to another. They were not decorative in the way that later Mappe Mundi were decorative. They were tools, and they were treated as tools, which is part of why so few early examples survive. Charts that got used eventually got destroyed by use, rolled and unrolled, marked up, corrected, copied, worn away by hands and salt air, and the ordinary violence of life aboard a working vessel. The defining visual feature of a Portolan chart is the network of rhumb lines radiating outward from compass roses scattered across the surface. Spread those lines densely enough, and they create a kind of geometric web that covers the whole chart, and they served a direct navigational purpose. A pilot who needed to sail from Genoa to Alexandria could find the compass bearing by stretching a thread or straightedge along the relevant line and reading the direction off the nearest rose. The entire visual logic of the chart organized itself around this practical function. Interior geography was sparse, sometimes non-existent. The coastlines were everything. This matters because it means the tradition Piri Reis inherited was already a tradition of compilation and copying as much as it was a tradition of original observation. The major workshops that produced Portolan charts, centered in Majorca, Genoa, Venice, and later Lisbon, worked from existing charts as much as from fresh pilot accounts. A cartographer in a Majorcan workshop in 1375 did not go out and survey the coastline himself. He worked from charts that had been corrected and updated by generations of pilots, comparing versions, resolving contradictions, making judgments about which version of a contested coastline to trust when two sources disagreed. The result was a cumulative product, a synthesis of everything that had been recorded and compared and adjusted over time. Piri Reis was doing exactly this, but with a wider range of sources than any Mediterranean cartographer had faced before, and with the additional complication that some of his sources were describing coastlines nobody in his workshop had ever seen. The Mediterranean was known, the Atlantic was not, and the methods that worked beautifully for capturing a coastline you could verify against your own experience began to show strain when applied to information arriving second-hand, third-hand, sometimes translated across 2 or 3 languages before it reached Istanbul. The physical object he was creating had its own demands. The map was drawn on gazelle skin, vellum, prepared animal hide, the standard material for important documents and charts of the period. Vellum was expensive, labour-intensive to prepare, and unforgiving in ways that paper is not. You could not easily erase a line drawn in the dense, mineral-rich inks that cartographers used. A mistake meant working around it or starting over, and starting over meant more expense, more time, more of the hide that had been carefully scraped and stretched and dried. This was not a medium that encouraged improvisation. It encouraged deliberate, planned work, laying out the geometry of compass roses and rhumb lines first, establishing the structural skeleton of the chart before filling in the geographic detail, copying coastlines from source charts with as much fidelity as the transfer process allowed. The copying process itself introduced distortions that we tend to underestimate because we are used to the mechanical precision of modern reproduction. When you copy a coastline by hand from one chart to another, small errors accumulate. A curve that was drawn slightly too tight gets copied, as a curve drawn slightly too tight, and then copied again, and each iteration can drift a little further from whatever the original observation actually recorded. When you are stitching together information from multiple source charts, each drawn at a slightly different scale, each oriented slightly differently, each using conventions that might not quite match, the problem compounds. Features that appear on one chart and not another have to be placed somewhere, and the placement involves judgment about where they fit relative to features that do appear on both. That judgment can be wrong. It can be consistently wrong in ways that produce systematic errors. A coastline that is recognizable but displaced, a peninsula that is the right shape but in the wrong position, a set of islands that are identifiable but arranged in a configuration that no longer matches the geography as we know it. What Piri Reis was attempting, in other words, was not just copying, it was integration. He was trying to take a collection of sources that did not fully agree with each other and produce something coherent, something that a pilot could use, something that honoured the best available information while making reasonable choices about what to do when the available information conflicted. That is a sophisticated intellectual task even before you account for the fact that his sources varied enormously in their reliability, that some had been generated by skilled navigators with good instruments, and some had been generated by people working from memory or hearsay, and that he often had no way of knowing which was which. A map built this way can be both impressive and imperfect at the same time. And this is a distinction worth holding carefully, because it is easy to treat those two qualities as contradictory when they are not. The same chart can display remarkable accuracy in the places where Piri had good sources and show notable distortion, in the places where his sources were thin, conflicting, or simply wrong. A coastline that is eerily precise in one region and puzzlingly off in the next is not a contradiction that requires an extraordinary explanation. It is exactly what you would expect from a skilled craftsman working with uneven materials. That unevenness is actually one of the most useful things about the map from a scholarly perspective, because it functions almost like a record of source quality. Where the chart is accurate, we can infer that good information was available. Where it drifts, we can start asking why. What sources was he working from in that region? How were they generated? What errors might they have carried with them from their own origins? The map becomes, in this reading, not just a document about geography, but a document about the information networks of the early 16th century, a kind of record of what was known, where it came from, and how far it had travelled before it reached a workshop in Istanbul and got transferred line by careful line onto a piece of prepared skin. Piri Reis was working within a tradition, with specific materials, using specific methods, operating under specific constraints. The map he produced reflects all of those things, the accumulated sophistication of 2 centuries of Mediterranean cartography, the ambition to extend that tradition to a suddenly expanded world, and the inevitable friction that comes from pushing a set of tools beyond the conditions they were designed for. That friction left marks. Some of those marks look from a distance like wonders. Others look like errors, often they are both. What exists today is not the full map. This is a fact that tends to get quietly skipped over in most discussions of the Piri Reis map, which is unfortunate because it changes everything about how you should interpret what you're looking at. The object that survives, the object that has been photographed and debated and cited as evidence of everything from lost civilizations to alien cartographers, is a fragment, a portion, a piece of something larger that no longer exists in its entirety, separated from the rest of itself by 5 centuries of history, with whatever context those missing sections might have provided gone along with them. Picture it this way. You find a page torn from a book. The page contains something striking, something that doesn't quite make sense on its own, a passage that seems to refer to something larger, a conclusion without a premise, a detail that seems to demand explanation. You could spend years puzzling over that page, generating theories about what it means and where it came from, and what kind of book could possibly contain it. Or you could remember first that it is one page from a longer work, and that your confusion might dissolve entirely if the other pages were available. The Piri Reis map is that page. Most of the book is missing. What survives covers roughly the western Atlantic world as it was understood in 1513, a portion of the Iberian Peninsula in the upper right, the western coast of Africa sweeping down the right side, and across the ocean to the left, the islands and coastlines of the newly encountered lands in the Americas. The Atlantic fills the centre. You can trace the Caribbean island chains, recognize fragments of what would become the mapped coasts of South America and Central America, identify the Canaries and the Azores sitting in their approximate positions. It is a recognizable Atlantic world, filtered through the conventions of Portolan cartography, and assembled from sources that ranged enormously in their quality and their origins. But this is perhaps a third of what Piri originally made. The 1513 work was a world map, a mappa mundi in the Portoland tradition, intended to cover the known world in something approaching its totality. The portions covering the eastern Mediterranean, the Indian Ocean, Asia, and whatever Piri placed in other regions of the globe are gone. Where they went is not certain. Some scholars believe the full map was eventually separated and portions were lost to the ordinary attrition of time, fire, water, neglect, the slow disintegration of materials that were never meant to last forever. What remained was what remained, preserved almost by accident in the archives of the Topkapi Palace until its rediscovery in 1929. The consequence of this fragmentation is that a great deal of the context that would allow us to interpret the surviving portion has vanished with the missing sections. Piri's compositional choices, his approach to scale, the way he resolved conflicts between sources across a larger geographic canvas, all of that is unavailable to us. We can only see what he did with the Atlantic, and we are asked to draw conclusions about the whole from a part. That is an invitation to misreading, and misreading is exactly what has happened with considerable regularity over the past century. When you look at the fragment itself, really look at it, not at a reproduction, but at photographs taken closely enough to see the texture of the vellum and the density of the ink, what you encounter is something richer and stranger than the abstractions of cartographic debate might suggest. The map is not a spare scientific document. It is a visual world, crowded and vivid, filled with more than coastlines and rumblines. There are annotations scattered across the surface, written in the Ottoman Turkish of the early 16th century, in a hand that is careful and deliberate, recording notes about places, about sources, about the character of the lands depicted. Some of these notes are practical, the kind of information a navigator might want. Others are more discursive, touching on the history of the sources Piri consulted, the circumstances under which certain coastlines were discovered, the reliability or unreliability of particular accounts. These annotations are among the most valuable things about the map, precisely because they give Piri's own voice, his own attempt to explain what he was doing and where his information came from, and yet they are frequently omitted from popular discussions that prefer the mystery of the map's images to the more complicated reality of his explanations. The land masses themselves are populated. Animals appear in the interiors, creatures that mix genuine zoological observation with the inherited conventions of medieval geography, where unknown territories were understood to harbour wonders. A large animal that might be interpreted as a llama or a guanaco appears in South America, which is interesting in its own right as evidence of early information reaching Piri's sources. Fantastical creatures appear elsewhere, carrying the weight of a tradition that expected the unknown world to be inhabited by things that defied ordinary experience. These are not errors exactly. They are a visual language, a set of conventions that any educated viewer of the period would have recognized and understood as indicating territory that was partly observed and partly imagined. Ships appear in the ocean, small and meticulous, marking the routes that had made the map possible. Islands are labelled and coloured. The rum lines extend across the surface, organising the geometry of the chart, establishing the underlying structure that any Portolan-trained eye would have used to navigate the image. Decorative elements frame and anchor the whole composition in ways that situate it firmly in the visual culture of the early 16th century Islamic world, drawing on aesthetic traditions that Piri had absorbed as thoroughly as he had absorbed the cartographic ones. All of this is visible, and all of it matters. But what is not visible, what cannot be seen because it no longer exists, shapes interpretation just as powerfully as what remains. When a researcher looks at the southern extension of the South American coastline and asks what that landmass could be, they are doing so without access to whatever Piri placed to the east of it, without knowing how that coastline connected to the broader geographic vision of the original whole. When a theorist argues that a particular feature is anomalously accurate or anomalously displaced, they are making that argument from a fragment without the fuller context that might confirm or complicate or simply explain what they are seeing. What it does not deserve is interpretation that forgets its incompleteness. Every dramatic claim made about this map, every announcement of anomalous accuracy, or impossible knowledge, or evidence of contact with lost civilizations, is a claim made about a fragment. The missing context is not a minor caveat. It is a fundamental condition of the problem, and yet somehow it keeps getting treated as a footnote rather than a foundation, which tells you something about how much easier it is to generate a mystery than to sit with the discomfort of genuine, irreducible uncertainty. Unroll the fragment in your mind and begin at the top right, where the geography is most familiar. The Iberian Peninsula is there, compressed, somewhat foreshortened, recognizable, if you know what you're looking for. The western coast of Africa descends along the right margin of the image, and if you trace it with attention, you will find that it holds together reasonably well. The Gulf of Guinea curves in the right direction. The overall shape of the African coastline along the Atlantic is not the wild guesswork of someone who had never encountered reliable source material. This portion of the map reflects the cumulative achievement of Portuguese exploration, conducted over the better part of a century before Piri sat down to compile his sources in 1513. Dozens of expeditions, careful dead reckoning, pilots who had sailed those coasts repeatedly and committed their observations to charts. All of that accumulated precision flows into this section of the fragment, and it shows: cross the Atlantic to the left side of the image and the Caribbean takes shape. The island chains of the Greater and Lesser Antilles appear in recognizable clusters, though their individual shapes and relative positions are distorted in ways that become understandable once you remember that the cartographers of 1513 were not working from overhead satellite photography, but from the compass bearings and estimated distances of ships moving through unfamiliar water in real time. Cuba and Hispaniola are there. The overall sense of the Caribbean as an archipelago region is present and legible. This is territory that had been visited, sailed around, argued about, and partially mapped by Spanish and Portuguese navigators in the 20 years between Columbus's first voyage and the date Piri completed his work. Its presence on the map is not mysterious. It is the cartographic deposit of exactly the kind of intense, competitive, imprecise, but persistent exploration that characterized those 2 decades. South America is where the interpretation begins to get complicated, and where the gap between what the map shows and what viewers sometimes want it to show becomes most significant. The northern coast of South America, roughly the coastline running from what is now Venezuela eastward toward the Atlantic, tracks in a direction that is broadly recognizable. It is displaced, compressed, and distorted in ways consistent with the difficulties of estimating longitude in this period, but the essential geographic relationship is there. A viewer with patience and a willingness to account for early 16th century conventions of coastal survey can trace the correspondence without too much strain. The eastern coast of South America, running southward, is more contested. The coastline extends downward along what would be the Brazilian coast, and here the distortions accumulate. Scale becomes inconsistent. The relationship between coastal features and their real-world counterparts becomes harder to verify with confidence. Scholars have proposed identifications for various bays, capes, and river mouths along this section, but those identifications are not universally accepted, and different researchers working from the same image have reached different conclusions. This is not evidence of mystery. It is evidence of the ordinary difficulty of reading a map made without the tools that would make precision possible, assembled from sources of varying reliability, and then interpreted across 5 centuries by people working backward from a known geography that the original cartographer was still in the process of discovering. Then the coastline continues south, and here is where attention tends to concentrate, because at some point the familiar South American coast gives way to something less obviously identifiable, a landmass that extends toward and then along the bottom of the fragment, curving in ways that have generated more interpretive energy than almost any other cartographic feature of the early modern period. Before addressing what that extension might or might not represent, it is worth pausing on a particular kind of mistake that comes up repeatedly in discussions of this map. It is the mistake of expecting accuracy in the wrong direction. A modern viewer looking at the Piri Reis map tends to do so with a mental reference point drawn from satellite imagery. The clean, overhead, proportionally correct outlines of continents that any contemporary atlas provides. When that viewer places the fragment beside a modern map and finds correspondence, they register accuracy. When they find discrepancy, they register error or distortion. But this comparison is not really between two maps. It is between a Portolan chart and a satellite photograph, across 5 centuries of methodological development, and the surprise is not that they differ, but that they agree as often as they do. Portolan charts were not constructed to reproduce the bird's-eye view of geographic space that modern mapping assumes. They were constructed from bearing and distance observations, stitched together along coastlines travelled by ships, with interiors filled by inference, convention, and whatever reports were available. The geometry that results is not the geometry of modern projection. Coastlines that were sailed carefully can appear with startling precision in the dimension of direction, while distances and shapes in the cross-ocean or interior dimension are systematically compressed or expanded in ways that have nothing to do with ignorance and everything to do with method. This is the context in which the question of whether the Piri Reis map is too accurate needs to be placed. Some researchers, encountering sections of the map that seem to correspond well to known coastlines, have argued that the correspondence is anomalously good, better than the technology and knowledge of 1513 could plausibly produce. Others, examining the same sections with equal care, have found the accuracy unremarkable and the distortions entirely consistent with early 16th century cartographic practice. These are not merely differences of opinion. They reflect fundamentally different frameworks for asking the question, and the framework matters enormously. The central question the fragment poses is therefore not really, is this map accurate? The central question is, what kind of accuracy was possible? What kind was attempted? And are we comparing like with like when we evaluate what we see? A map made in 1513 from compiled Portolan sources, produced without astronomical methods for longitude, assembled from dozens of charts of uneven quality in a tradition that valued navigational utility over geometric perfection. That map will look from some angles impressively consistent with the real world, and from other angles strikingly wrong, and both of those observations will be true simultaneously, and neither will be particularly mysterious. What the fragment actually shows, when you look at it with these calibrations in place, is a sophisticated and ambitious synthesis of early 16th century geographic knowledge about the Atlantic world, recognizable where knowledge was most developed, uncertain and distorted where sources were thin or conflicting, and genuinely ambiguous in the places where interpretation has to stretch furthest across the gap between what Piri knew and what we can verify. That is what the surviving piece of a larger map, compiled by a skilled Ottoman cartographer in 1513, from a library of sources he only partially understood, looks like. The question is whether that is enough to explain everything the fragment contains. To get closer to that question, you have to stop looking only at the coastlines and start listening to the man who drew them. The Piri Reis map does not arrive in silence. It comes with notes, marginal annotations written by Piri himself, and those notes are one of the most important pieces of evidence we have. They do not solve the mystery. They do something more useful than that. They tell us how Piri wanted the map to be understood. In one of the best-known statements attached to the map, Piri explains that he did not discover these lands personally and did not draw the chart from a single original. He says, in substance, that this was a compilation made from many earlier maps and charts. Different translations render the wording somewhat differently, but the core claim is consistent. He assembled the map from about 20 source materials, including ancient charts, more recent nautical maps, and a map associated with Columbus. In another version of the same idea, he emphasizes that he brought these materials together and reduced them to one image. That matters immediately because it places the map in exactly the tradition it appears to belong to. Piri is not presenting himself as a lone genius producing impossible knowledge from nowhere. He is presenting himself as a compiler, an editor, a synthesizer of inherited information. In the early modern world, that was not a modest claim. It was a serious cartographic achievement, and it also tells us something important about what we should mean when we use the word source. In modern conversation, a source can sound fixed and authoritative, as if there were one master map somewhere in the background, and Piri simply copied it. That is not how this world worked. A chart was not a static object carrying final truth from one generation to the next. It was a working instrument. It was copied by hand, corrected at sea, supplemented by rumour, improved by pilots, degraded by errors, translated across languages, and reshaped by the priorities of whoever used it next. To say that Piri used older maps is not to say that he had access to pure originals. It is to say that he entered a living chain of transmission. His annotations point especially toward two categories of source material that have fascinated later readers: Portuguese charts and what he calls maps of Columbus. The Portuguese reference is the less sensational and, in some ways, the more significant. By 1513, Portuguese navigators had spent generations pushing down the west coast of Africa, crossing into the South Atlantic, and establishing practical sea routes that depended on usable cartography. If a section of Piri's map looks informed along the African coast or around parts of the Atlantic, Portuguese charts are one of the most straightforward explanations available. When Piri says he drew on Portuguese material, historians generally take that seriously because it fits the political and geographic reality of the period. The Portuguese possessed valuable navigational knowledge. Their charts circulated even when guarded. Some were captured. Some were copied. Some were seen indirectly through other maps. Information leaked, because information always leaks, especially when empires compete by sea. The mention of Columbus is more complicated, and therefore more alluring. In one annotation, Piri refers to a chart connected to Columbus, often translated as a map made by Columbus or derived from Columbus. Elsewhere he includes a note about a captured Spanish sailor who had sailed with Columbus and provided information. The exact wording of these annotations has been discussed intensely, and the textual history is not always clean enough to support dramatic certainty. But taken together, the notes suggest that Piri believed at least some of his Western Atlantic information came, directly or indirectly, from material associated with the Columbian voyages. That does not mean we possess Columbus's own lost master map, hidden inside the fragment like a secret layer waiting to be extracted. It means something both more ordinary and more historically plausible. Piri had access to reports, copies, derivatives, or second-hand cartographic products that were believed to trace back to Columbus and the earliest Spanish exploration of the Caribbean. In a world where documents moved through capture, trade, diplomacy, and piracy, that is entirely possible. What would be surprising is not that such information travelled, but that it remained perfectly sealed. And this is where modern readers can easily mishear what Piri is claiming. When he says he compiled from many maps, he is not necessarily guaranteeing the pedigree of every one of them by modern archival standards. He is not furnishing a bibliography. He is asserting authority in the language available to an early 16th century cartographer. He is saying, in effect, this chart deserves confidence because it is built from accumulated expertise. It draws on respected materials. It incorporates knowledge from those who have sailed these waters. It is not a fantasy. That kind of statement had real meaning, but it also had elasticity. Early modern mapmakers often copied, adapted, conflated, and improved in ways that do not map neatly onto modern ideas of authorship. If Piri had a Portuguese chart, that chart might itself have incorporated Spanish information. If he had a Spanish chart linked to Columbus, that chart might have been a copy of a copy, altered by another hand. If he drew from an older map, he might preserve some coastlines closely, while adjusting others to fit newer reports or to make the composite coherent. Compilation was not passive transcription. It was interpretation. You can think of it less as tracing and more as weaving. A compiler like Piri would be selecting among conflicting outlines, reconciling different scales, deciding which coastline looked more trustworthy, and forcing materials made for different purposes into a single visual frame. One source might be strong along Africa and weak in the Caribbean. Another might offer useful island placements, but poor continental proportions. A third might contain names, legends, or travel lore rather than clean geometry. To combine them was to make judgment calls constantly. Every judgment introduced both intelligence and risk. So when later enthusiasts point to Piri's notes as proof that he possessed ancient or extraordinary originals, historians tend to slow the conversation down. The notes do support the claim that he worked from multiple earlier sources. They do support the presence of Iberian information in the map. They do support the possibility that some of that information descended from charts associated with Columbus. But they do not tell us exactly which source governed which section of coastline, how accurate those sources were before Piri touched them, or how much transformation occurred in the act of compilation. That is why scholars give these marginal notes substantial but not unlimited weight. They are precious evidence because they are near contemporary, attached to the artifact, and written by the compiler himself. In a field where so much must be inferred indirectly, that is no small thing. You cannot simply dismiss what Piri says about his own working method. At the same time, historians are trained not to treat self-description as infallible. Authors misunderstand their materials. They exaggerate. They compress complex processes into elegant claims. They use prestige language. They repeat what they were told about a chart's origin without being able to verify it in the way a modern archivist would want to verify it. So the annotations are used neither as decoration nor as revelation. They are evidence to be tested against the map itself, against what is known of early 16th century cartography, and against the broader movement of geographic knowledge around the Mediterranean and Atlantic worlds. And once you read them that way, their deepest significance becomes clear, far from suggesting a map that should not exist. Piri's notes describe exactly the kind of map that should exist in an age of conquest, capture, and maritime rivalry. A composite object made at the edge of several information systems at once, carrying fragments of Portuguese sailing knowledge, fragments of Spanish Atlantic discovery, and whatever else a skilled Ottoman admiral cartographer could gather, compare, and transform into a single ambitious chart. In other words, the mystery does not begin with impossible knowledge falling from the sky. It begins with a question that is more human, more historical, and in some ways more interesting. How did all of that knowledge travel from Iberian ships and secretive chart rooms into the hands of an Ottoman mapmaker in Istanbul? The short answer is that it travelled the way valuable things usually travel in a competitive world, through official channels when possible, and through unofficial ones almost constantly. To imagine 16th century cartography as a locked cabinet of state secrets is only half right. Iberian crowns, especially Portugal, did try to control nautical knowledge. Routes, soundings, latitudes, coastal profiles, island locations, wind systems, these were not abstract curiosities. They were commercial weapons. A reliable chart could mean safe arrival, profitable cargo, military advantage, and imperial reach. In a world where a voyage could cost a fortune and sink just as easily, information had material weight. So yes, maps were guarded, pilots were regulated, certain charts were housed in royal institutions, copies could be restricted. Overseas navigation was not something Iberian powers wanted to hand freely to rivals. But secrecy in principle is not the same as secrecy in practice. The people who carried this knowledge were not silent machines moving inside perfect bureaucratic systems. They were sailors, pilots, merchants, interpreters, captains, prisoners, converts, renegades, corsairs, diplomats, and opportunists. They drank together in ports, they sold favours, they were captured in storms, they defected, they boasted, they copied what they were not supposed to copy, they passed along fragments they barely understood. Sometimes an empire tried to protect a chart, and the chart itself never left official custody. But the knowledge on that chart could still leak out through memory, through sketches, through derivative copies, through conversations held over cargo accounts or ransom negotiations. And that matters because Piri Reis did not need access to a single pristine Iberian archive in order to absorb Iberian knowledge. He only needed access to the porous human network that surrounded it. The Mediterranean was perfect for that kind of leakage. It is easy, looking backward, to separate the Atlantic world from the Ottoman world as if they were distinct stages in different stories. But for the people living through the period, the sea lanes connected more than our categories suggest. The Western Mediterranean, North Africa, Iberia, Italy, the Levant, and the great ports of the Ottoman realm formed a dense zone of movement. Ships carried not just spices, metals, timber, grain, and slaves. They carried intelligence, they carried rumour, they carried practical seafaring knowledge in the hands of men who moved from one employer to another and from one coast to the next. A port was never just a port. It was an information market. In places like Venice, Genoa, Majorca, Alexandria, Tunis, Algiers, Rhodes, and eventually Istanbul, mariners from different traditions crossed paths constantly. Some were at war. Some were in business. Many were both, depending on the season and the cargo. Charts changed hands in obvious ways and in obscure ones. A merchant might commission a copy. A pilot might lend a chart to be recopied and regret it later. A captured vessel might be searched not only for goods but for papers. A cartographer might never see the original chart at all, but hear a pilot describe a coastline. Then compare that description against another map already in his possession. This is one reason modern expectations can mislead us. We often imagine knowledge transfer as something tidy. Document A moves from archive B to scholar C. Early modern maritime knowledge moved more like water through cracks. Some of it flowed in formal channels, much of it seeped. Piracy and private warfare were especially important in that process. The line between pirate, privateer, corsair, and naval servant was often thinner than later readers expect. Across the Mediterranean, Christian and Muslim maritime powers seized one another's ships as a normal feature of conflict. When a ship was taken, its cargo mattered. So did its passengers. So did its paperwork. Rutters, portolans, pilot books, letters, logs, and charts could all become spoils. Even when the documents themselves were not preserved, the people aboard could become sources. A captured pilot was valuable. A sailor who had crossed the Atlantic or rounded unfamiliar coasts carried geographic intelligence in his head. Under interrogation, under inducement, under threat, or simply in the long afterlife of captivity, such people could transmit knowledge that would then be reframed, translated, and incorporated elsewhere. That possibility is not speculative in some grand, cinematic sense. It is built into the political ecology of the time. Maritime empires were spying on one another because they had every reason to. Commerce, war, and reconnaissance overlapped. Courts wanted to know what rival powers had discovered, which routes they favoured, which coasts were safe, where islands lay, how currents behaved. Map-making sat inside that struggle. Portugal in particular had reason to guard what it knew. Its overseas strategy depended on maintaining a navigational edge, especially along the African coast and into the Indian Ocean. The farther Portuguese shipping stretched, the more valuable accurate route knowledge became. Yet that very success increased the number of people exposed to the information. More voyages meant more pilots. More pilots meant more copies, more memories, more opportunities for loss or theft. An empire can centralize a chart room. It cannot fully centralize every eye that has seen the chart. Spain faced a related problem in the West. The new Atlantic discoveries were politically precious and economically explosive, but the machinery required to exploit them generated paperwork, personnel, and movement on a scale that made absolute containment unrealistic. Pilots trained, expeditions multiplied. Colonial administrators wrote reports. Sailors returned home. Foreign observers watched. Rival merchants listened. Even partial, distorted, or outdated knowledge could still travel far. And partial knowledge was often enough. An Ottoman cartographer did not need every Iberian secret to produce a striking map. He needed pieces, enough to improve outlines, locate islands, refine distances in some zones, and supplement older Mediterranean habits of mapping with newer Atlantic inputs. A fragment of a Portuguese chart here, a Spanish report there, a captured sailor's testimony somewhere else. Compilation could do the rest. That is what makes the Mediterranean crossroads so important to this story. Istanbul was not a remote endpoint disconnected from Atlantic discovery. It was the capital of an empire deeply entangled in Mediterranean competition, diplomacy, and maritime observation. News from the West did not arrive there by miracle. It arrived because the Ottoman world was already plugged into systems that collected and processed strategic information. Piri himself belonged to that world. He was not a cloistered scholar waiting for books to come to him. He was a seaman, an officer, and a man connected to corsair and naval networks. That background matters because charts do not circulate only through libraries. They circulate through communities of practice. Men who sail, raid, trade, and negotiate are often better positioned to gather usable geographic intelligence than someone sitting beside a shelf of manuscripts. So if we ask for plausible pathways from Iberia to Istanbul, several appear immediately. One is direct capture. Iberian ships, or ships carrying Iberian materials, are seized in war or corsair action, and charts or navigational notes are taken. Another is indirect copying. An Italian, Majorcan, North African, or Levantine intermediary obtains access to Iberian cartographic information and reproduces part of it, intentionally or casually, before that derivative chart travels onward. A third is human transmission. Sailors, pilots, prisoners, converts, and merchants recount routes and coastlines from experience, allowing cartographers to update existing maps without possessing the original documents. A fourth is espionage in the broadest sense. Courts, merchants, and maritime actors deliberately seek intelligence about rival discoveries, whether by bribery, observation, questioning, or recruitment. And then there is the simplest pathway of all, ordinary circulation. Not lawful, not fully illicit, just common early modern leakage. A chart is copied because someone wants a copy. A manuscript travels because its owner moves. A pilot changes allegiance. A translator renders notes into another language. A skilled compiler gathers enough overlapping fragments that the original lines of transmission disappear. By the time knowledge reached Piri Reis, it may already have passed through several hands, several languages, and several misunderstandings, which is precisely why the map can contain real information without preserving a neat chain of custody. The pipeline from Iberia to Istanbul was not a single pipe. It was a web, commercial, military, diplomatic, and criminal at the same time, guarded at the centre, porous at the edges, and constantly animated by people who had strong reasons to steal, sell, remember, exaggerate, and repurpose what they knew. And once you see that, the idea that Atlantic discoveries could reach an Ottoman cartographer stops looking improbable. The harder question is not whether the information could travel. It is what exactly was travelling under the name of Columbus, and that is where the story becomes more delicate. When people hear that Piri Reis referred to a map connected to Columbus, the imagination leaps straight to a dramatic image. Columbus himself hunched over a chart, drawing the New World in his own hand, and that very document somehow making its way across rival empires into Ottoman hands. It is a powerful image. It is also much more certainty than the evidence allows. What do we actually know? We know Columbus sailed with navigational materials because no one made repeated Atlantic voyages by instinct alone. He used charts, dead reckoning, latitude estimates, reports from earlier mariners, and the practical knowledge carried by pilots. He also generated information through his own voyages, island positions as he understood them, coastal impressions, sailing distances, bearings, and descriptions of harbours and currents. Some of that information entered letters, logs, official reports, and the working geography of the Spanish world. But knowing that Columbus used and produced navigational knowledge is not the same as possessing his original charts. That is the first limit. Very little from the Age of Discovery survives in the clean autograph form modern audiences tend to imagine. Documents were used hard. They travelled at sea, they were folded, corrected, copied, annotated, exposed to salt air, and replaced when new information arrived. Working charts were tools before they were museum objects. Many vanished because no one thought to preserve them. Others disappeared in archive losses, shipwrecks, fires, bureaucratic neglect, or simple obsolescence. In some cases we know a document once existed, only because another document mentions it. So yes, Columbus almost certainly had charts. He may have drawn or supervised charts. He certainly contributed to a growing body of Atlantic mapping. But whether a specific original chart by Columbus survived long enough to be copied, seized, or transmitted is another question entirely. And that is where the phrase "a map by Columbus" begins to blur. In early modern usage, authorship was not always the narrow, modern idea of a single-name creator producing one definitive object. A map could be by someone, because he made it, because he commissioned it, because it was based on his discoveries, because his pilots used it, because others believed it reflected his knowledge, or because later copyists attached his name to it as a marker of authority. The label could refer to direct authorship. It could also refer to lineage. That distinction matters more than it might seem. If Piri Reis says he used material associated with Columbus, that does not force us to imagine Columbus's own pen strokes preserved on parchment. It could mean a derivative Spanish chart incorporating Columbian discoveries. It could mean a pilot's copy made from an earlier exemplar. It could mean a report distilled from conversations with sailors who had sailed under Columbus or in the routes opened by him. It could even mean a chart identified by reputation rather than proven authorship. This is the Columbus map, meaning the map from the Columbus tradition. And once we move into the world of copies, another problem appears immediately. Copies change. Not because every copyist was careless, but because early cartography was a living practice. A chart was often recopied by someone working in a different workshop, speaking a different language, using different conventions, and trying to reconcile more than one source at the same time. Place names might be misunderstood, numbers might be misread, a coastal bend might be smoothed, sharpened, or stretched to fit a familiar layout. One pilot's estimate of distance could be merged with another pilot's outline. A chart made for practical sailing might later be adapted into a more general geographic image, changing its geometry in the process. A single error could travel for decades. So could a single overconfident correction. Think about what happens when information passes from voyage to memory, from memory to notes, from notes to a chart, from that chart to a copy, and from that copy into a compilation. At each step, the result may preserve something real while also drifting away from its starting point, not into fantasy, necessarily, just into accumulated distortion. This is especially true when coastlines are new, incomplete, or only partly understood. Early explorers rarely surveyed a shore from end to end with modern precision. They glimpsed sections of coast, entered some bays, missed others, mistook islands for peninsulas, or connected separate reports into a continuous line that looked more confident on paper than it had ever been at sea. Later copyists inherited those uncertainties and often made them look more solid than they really were. So if some Colombian material did feed into the chain behind Piri Reis, we should expect mutation, not purity. That does not make the connection meaningless. In some ways it makes it more historically plausible. Real knowledge in this period often survives, not as a pristine original, but as a family resemblance scattered across descendants. There is another reason to be cautious. Columbus did not explore a fully recognized America in the way later maps would depict it. He died still interpreting his discoveries through older assumptions about Asia and adjacent islands. The geographic picture available to him, and to those working immediately after him, was unstable. Coastlines that later generations separate clearly were, at first, entangled in argument, hope, and misidentification. So any Columbus map, whether direct or indirect, would belong to that uncertain moment. It would not be a magically correct modern outline hidden in the past. It would be an early attempt to fit startling new observations into inherited mental geography. That alone should temper some of the grander claims. At the same time, it keeps the mystery alive in a more interesting way, because even if no autograph Columbus chart survives, and even if Piri Reis never saw one, there may still be a genuine Colombian echo inside the map's ancestry. A Spanish source derived from early Caribbean and Atlantic experience could have reached intermediaries. A captured chart could have carried names, island placements, or coastal ideas traceable to voyages in Columbus's orbit. A report from a sailor, prisoner, or pilot might preserve practical details without preserving the document that first recorded them. The original may be gone while the information, altered and refracted, continues onward. This is one of the hardest things about reconstructing early cartographic history. We are often trying to identify invisible parents from surviving children. Scholars can compare outlines, labels, conventions, and historical context. They can ask whether a feature looks Iberian, Portuguese, Spanish, Portolan, or later. They can trace how certain names appear elsewhere. They can estimate what kinds of sources a compiler probably had. But they cannot always close the gap between probable influence and demonstrable possession. The archive does not give us everything. Sometimes it gives us only shadows, and insists we decide how much confidence a shadow deserves. So the honest answer is frustrating and fascinating at the same time. Something associated with Columbus may well stand behind part of what Piri Reis used. That possibility is not absurd. It fits the world of leakage, copying, captivity, and compilation we have already entered. But the surviving documentation does not let us point to a single lost original and say, this was the chart, this was its route, these were the exact hands through which it passed. We are left with a chain whose links are partly visible and partly imagined. And before that sounds like a weakness. It is worth remembering that this is normal for the period. Early maps are rarely transparent windows onto a single act of creation. They are composites, negotiations, inheritances. They preserve discovery, error, pride, guesswork, and repair all at once. Which means the real question is not simply whether Piri Reis had Columbus's map. It is how much transformation a piece of knowledge can undergo and still carry the memory of where it came from. And to answer that, we have to look at something even more treacherous than authorship. We have to look at the map itself, and at what happens when you try to force a round world onto a flat surface. Because once we ask what happens when knowledge is copied, merged, and inherited, another problem rises up beneath everything else. The Earth is not flat. That sounds almost too obvious to mention, but for maps it changes everything. The moment you try to represent a curved surface on parchment, you are making compromises. There is no perfect solution. You can preserve some relationships, but not all of them at once. Shape begins to tug against distance. Distance begins to tug against direction. Area starts to drift. Angles behave well in one region and badly in another. The farther you move from the conditions a mapping system was built for, the more those hidden tensions begin to show. This is the first thing that gets lost when people stare at the Piri Reis map and start talking about impossible accuracy. They often assume there are only two options. Either the coastline matches modern geography with uncanny precision, or it does not, and the map is worthless. But early cartography does not work in that neat, binary way. A map can preserve real, valuable geographic information and still look wrong to us, because the information has been transferred through a geometry that bends, stretches, or compresses it. In other words, a strange-looking coastline is not automatically evidence of secret knowledge. Sometimes it is evidence of ordinary cartographic strain. To see why, it helps to remember the kind of mapping culture from which Piri Reis emerged. He worked in a world deeply shaped by Portolan charts, practical sea charts built around coastlines, compass directions, and networks of rhumb lines radiating across the page. These charts were extraordinarily useful for navigation in the Mediterranean and nearby waters. For sailors moving from port to port along known coasts, they could be remarkably effective. They were not primitive doodles, they were serious working instruments. But instruments are designed for conditions. Portolan-style geometry behaved best in the maritime environments for which it evolved, especially where accumulated sailing directions and coastal experience could be translated into a coherent network over a relatively limited range. Extend that same logic outward into the Atlantic, then farther south along unfamiliar coasts, then across larger spans of ocean and latitude, and the neatness begins to fray. A charting system that works elegantly in one sea does not necessarily scale cleanly to a much larger world. This matters enormously for the Piri Reis map, because it is not simply a modern atlas page before its time. It is a compilation trying to absorb information from different traditions, different voyages, and different assumptions about global space. Some parts may descend from Portolan practice. Some parts may reflect Iberian Atlantic exploration. Some may carry echoes of older geographical habits. When those streams meet on one sheet, the result does not have to be consistently projected in the way modern maps are. It can be locally accurate in one area, stretched in another, and conceptually patched together in a third. That patchwork quality can make coastlines look bizarre, even when the underlying reports were not bizarre at all. And then there is scale. On a modern map, we expect scale to be explicit and stable. We assume a given distance on paper translates predictably across the whole image, or at least within a clearly defined projection. But in early world mapping, especially when multiple source materials were being fused, scale could drift. One source might exaggerate distances between islands, another might compress a continental coast. A compiler might try to reconcile them visually without having a mathematically unified framework strong enough to keep every region in proportion. So one section of shoreline may look unusually elongated, while another appears pinched or swung eastward or westward. That is not necessarily fraud. It is not necessarily fantasy. It can be the visible scar left by compilation. Latitude and longitude only deepen the problem. Latitude, at least in rough form, was the easier of the two. Mariners could estimate it with observations of the sun or stars, though not with perfect consistency, and errors still crept in through instruments, weather, and technique. But longitude was the real torment. Before accurate marine chronometers, determining east-west position at sea was notoriously difficult. Sailors relied on dead reckoning, estimated speed, headings, elapsed time, and accumulated judgment. Those methods could be useful, but they could also drift badly over long distances. And once longitude drifts, coastlines drift with it. A bay may sit too far east, a cape may be pulled too far west. A coastline pieced together from separate voyages may develop a subtle twist that becomes dramatic once transferred to a larger map. If one expedition's numbers are merged with another expedition's outline, the final result may preserve the general existence of places while distorting their relationships. This is especially important when people compare the Piri Reis fragment directly to a modern globe and announce that only some advanced forgotten source could explain what they think they see. But modern comparison can be deceptive. If you take an early coastline drawn through a different projection logic, uncertain longitudes, and composite source material, then force it to match a modern map point for point, you may create the illusion of mystery where there is really a technical mismatch. The eye wants recognition. It wants to identify a familiar continent hiding inside an unfamiliar outline. And once that desire takes over, every bend starts to look like a coded correspondence. Sometimes the map is not impossibly accurate. Sometimes we are just being too literal. This does not mean the Piri Reis map is uninteresting, or that all claims of quality collapse into error. Quite the opposite. What is striking is that a 1513 compilation could gather so much Atlantic and South American information at all, and do so in a form that clearly reflects serious engagement with recent navigational knowledge. The achievement does not depend on the map being secretly modern. It is impressive enough as an early 16th century artifact negotiating the limits of its own tools. That, in some ways, is the more historically honest wonder, because technical explanation is not the enemy of mystery. It is what lets us distinguish the real mystery from the invented one. The real puzzle is how information from multiple voyages, multiple empires, and multiple cartographic habits was assembled so quickly and transmitted so effectively. The real achievement is the map's place inside a world where knowledge moved through seizure, copying, translation, and practical use. The real question is not why the coastlines fail to behave like satellite imagery. It is how much they reveal despite the fact that they were made without satellites, without chronometers, and without a universally consistent mathematical grid. Once we keep that in mind, the dramatic phrase impossible accuracy begins to lose some of its force, not because the map becomes ordinary, but because it becomes intelligible. Its oddities stop looking like proof of a hidden ancient civilization or a lost scientific superculture. They start looking like the ordinary, difficult consequences of trying to flatten a planet, merge imperfect reports, and draw a changing world before the basic problem of longitude had been solved. And that shift matters, because one of the most famous claims ever attached to the Piri Reis map depends almost entirely on misunderstanding those distortions. The claim that somewhere in this warped southern coastline, beneath all the stretching and turning and projection trouble, lies something astonishing: Antarctica. And this is where the legend hardens. The popular claim goes something like this. The Piri Reis map does not merely show the Atlantic, the Caribbean, and the eastern edge of South America. It also shows Antarctica. Not the Antarctica officially encountered by modern explorers in the 19th century, but Antarctica centuries earlier, hidden in plain sight on a 16th century chart. In stronger versions of the story, it is not just any Antarctica. It is the coast of Queen Maud Land, somehow recorded before ice covered it, as if the map preserves a memory from a civilization with knowledge no known culture of the early modern world should have possessed. That is the version that grips people, because if true, it does not just add a curious footnote to cartographic history, it tears a hole in it. Suddenly the map would not be an Ottoman compilation built from late medieval and early modern sources. It would become evidence for lost expeditions, vanished archives, forgotten sciences, perhaps even a human past far older and stranger than conventional history allows. A chart that begins inside the world of sailors, portolans, and imperial intelligence would be pulled into the realm of global secrets. And at first glance you can understand why the claim took hold. Look at the surviving fragment, and your eye is drawn downward to that long southern land mass extending beneath South America. It seems to continue where a viewer expects the familiar continent to end. It bends broadly eastward. It looks large, it looks consequential. To someone already primed by a modern globe, the thought comes quickly: if this is not just the tip of South America distorted beyond recognition, then maybe it is something farther south. Maybe it is another continent. Maybe it is Antarctica. Once that possibility is planted, certain features start to feel persuasive. The coastline appears attached to or flowing out from the South American coast in a way that can be read as a cartographic misunderstanding of the gap we now know as the Drake Passage. If a compiler lacked clean information about the far south, maybe the lands were fused together. Some segments look rugged or deeply indented, which encourages comparison to an unfamiliar polar shore. The sheer southward extension of the drawing also matters. On a modern map, Antarctica is the great landmass we expect at the bottom of the world, so any prominent southern coastline on an old chart can begin to attract that identity almost magnetically. And there is another psychological trick at work. If you already know the map has a reputation for odd precision in some areas, then an ambiguous shape is easier to promote into a revelation. The argument becomes cumulative in the wrong way. First, people hear that the map contains startlingly advanced knowledge. Then they hear that it shows an unexplained southern coast. By the time they reach the word Antarctica, the conclusion feels less like a leap than like the next dramatic step. But that feeling is not the same as proof. The Antarctica Claim became especially powerful in the 20th century, when the Piri Reis map moved from specialist interest into the wider culture of anomalies and historical mysteries. Instead of being discussed mainly as a 16th century compilation with difficult projection problems, it began to circulate as a kind of challenge object, a document presented not to be understood in context, but to unsettle the context itself. A major turning point came when writers and commentators started comparing the southern part of the map to modern Antarctic geography and treating the resemblance as meaningful. Some of the most influential versions appeared in the mid-20th century, especially after the map's rediscovery had already given it an aura of buried significance. Claims were amplified by figures willing to frame the chart as evidence of astonishing antiquity or lost geodetic knowledge. The story spread well beyond academic cartography into popular books, magazine features, radio discussions, and later television documentaries. And once the claim entered mystery literature, it found the perfect environment to thrive. Because mystery literature does not have to prove a case in the strict historical sense. It only has to keep a possibility alive. A coastline can be rotated a little, stretched a little, compared selectively, and narrated confidently. Mismatches can be blamed on projection. Missing details can be blamed on damage. Contradictions can be converted into intrigue. The more uncertain the geometry, the easier it becomes to claim that certainty is hiding underneath. In that setting, ambiguity is not a weakness. It is fuel. Soon the Piri Reis map was appearing in a familiar catalogue of wonders. Out-of-place artifacts, ancient high knowledge, lost civilizations, pre-flood archives, impossible survivals of scientific data. Antarctica gave the story its grandest hook, because Antarctica is not just remote. It is symbolically remote. It belongs to the edge of the known world. To say a map from 1513 includes, it is to suggest that history itself is missing a chapter. And then some versions went even further. Not only did the map supposedly show Antarctica, they argued, it showed Antarctica without its ice sheet, implying access to a coastline no ordinary 16th century navigator could have seen. That claim multiplied the drama enormously. Now the problem was no longer early discovery. It was prehistoric surveying. It invited the idea that some much older civilization had charted the continent before glaciation or under radically different conditions, and that fragments of this impossible knowledge somehow passed down through the ages until they reached Piri Reis. This is the point where the story becomes most seductive and most unstable, because every layer of speculation depends on the one beneath it. First, the southern coastline must really be Antarctica. Then it must correspond in a meaningful way to a specific Antarctic coast. Then the differences must be explained not as ordinary cartographic distortion, but as traces of a once accurate original. Then that original must be assigned to a source tradition, for which there is no clear historical chain. What begins as a visual suggestion quickly turns into a tower of assumptions. Still, the reason the claim survives is not simply that people want to believe in lost worlds. It is also that the map really does invite overreading. The fragment is incomplete. The southern region is awkward. The geometry is unstable. The labels and coastlines do not behave like modern atlas conventions. All of that creates interpretive space, and where interpretive space opens, dramatic identifications rush in. So before we decide what this southern land actually represents, we have to slow down and ask a more disciplined question. What are we really looking at when we look at that coastline? Is it a genuine memory of Antarctica, improbably preserved across centuries? Is it a distorted extension of South America? Is it a composite made from multiple reports that the compiler could not fully reconcile? Is it a cartographic habit inherited from older ideas about southern lands, where mapmakers often expected some kind of balancing continent in the far south, whether they had seen it or not? The Antarctica claim gains its force by moving too quickly from resemblance to conclusion. To evaluate it properly, we have to do the opposite. We have to compare that reading against other identifications that require fewer assumptions and fit more comfortably within what 16th century mapmaking actually was. Because the southern coastline may be mysterious, but mysterious is not the same thing as Antarctic. And the difference between those two words is where this whole argument really begins. The first alternative is also the least glamorous, and that is usually a good sign. What if the southern coastline is not a hidden polar continent at all, but South America drawn badly, stretched awkwardly, and fused with guesswork at the edge of the known world? That may sound deflating, but in the history of maps it is almost routine. By 1513, Europeans and their rivals had begun accumulating reports from the Atlantic world at high speed. But accumulation is not the same as clarity. Coasts were being encountered in pieces. Bearings were estimated under difficult conditions. Latitudes could sometimes be approximated with some confidence, but longitudes remained deeply troublesome. A cape seen on one voyage might be placed too far east. A river mouth described by another crew might be duplicated, shifted, or misunderstood. A broad continental sweep could be reconstructed from fragments that did not line up cleanly in the first place. When a cartographer tried to turn that unstable material into a single continuous coast, the result could bend, elongate, twist, or attach itself to things it should never have touched. And South America was especially vulnerable to that kind of distortion. For early 16th century mapmakers, the eastern bulge of Brazil was becoming more familiar, but the farther south one went, the thinner the evidence often became, and the more room there was for confusion. Reconnaissance did not advance everywhere evenly. Information came in bursts, often through rivalry, secrecy, and rumour. One stretch of coast might be based on sailing experience. The next might come from hearsay. The next from a copied chart already carrying inherited errors. If those pieces were merged on a single sheet, the seam lines did not announce themselves. They masqueraded as geography. So one mainstream reading of the Piri Reis fragment is simply that its southern extension reflects a malformed South American coastline, perhaps exaggerated by projection problems, perhaps compounded by a compiler trying to reconcile sources that did not agree. That explanation does not solve every question neatly, but it does fit the world the map came from. There is also a second possibility, closely related but slightly broader. The southern land may be a composite. Picture Piri's workshop for a moment, one chart weighted down with a knife, another curled at the edge, a sailor's account remembered in broken detail, a coastline copied from a chart that was already a copy. The final line on the parchment may look confident, but behind that line there may have been hesitation, argument, and compromise. Not a faithful copy of one original chart, and not the memory of one astonishing voyage, but a stitched-together product of different map traditions pressed into a single form. In that scenario, the lower part of the map might combine real coastal information with inherited assumptions about how lands should connect, or balance the world. Instead of showing one place cleanly, it would show several layers of knowledge laid over each other until they became difficult to separate. This matters because early cartography was not always trying to do what a modern atlas does. Today we expect a map either to represent observed geography or to mark uncertainty clearly. But on many older maps, certainty and uncertainty coexist on the same line. A coast could begin with practical sailing knowledge and end in conjecture without any dramatic break. A rumour of a land farther south might be attached to a known shore because the mapmaker believed the pieces probably belonged together. An anticipated strait might be omitted because no one had confirmed it yet. A hypothetical continuation could harden into an apparent coastline simply because the blank space felt intolerable. In other words, maps were not only records, they were arguments. They organized partial evidence into a visual claim about how the world probably fit together. And when evidence ran thin, probability could slide into imagination more easily than we might like. This is why the idea of fused coasts deserves serious attention. It is not a desperate modern rescue theory invented to protect conventional history. It is exactly the sort of thing that happened when cartographers worked at the frontier of knowledge. If a compiler had pieces of South American coastal data, scraps of older geographical expectation, and no secure understanding of what lay in the far southern Atlantic, then a hybrid shoreline is not surprising. It is almost what we should expect. Once you see that, the southern section of the Piri Reis map begins to look less like an impossible revelation and more like a familiar cartographic problem. Messy. Yes. Intriguing. Yes. but still operating within the known habits of the age. And that brings us to the strongest version of the mystery claim, the one that says this is not just Antarctica, but ice-free Antarctica. This is where caution matters most, because even if someone were to argue that the shape bears some vague resemblance to a southern polar coastline, the leap to ice-free Antarctica is far larger than people often admit. It requires not only identifying the land correctly, but also claiming that the map preserves coastal knowledge from a time before massive ice cover, or from some otherwise unattested method of seeing beneath it. That is an extraordinary chain of inference, and the evidentiary support for it is extraordinarily thin. The first problem is resemblance itself. The match is not exact, and once you have to rotate, stretch, select, and reinterpret a shape to make it fit, you are already moving away from straightforward identification. The second problem is historical transmission. There is no clear documented pathway showing how accurate prehistoric or ancient polar surveys, if they had existed, could have survived through centuries of copying and reached an Ottoman admiral in 1513. The third problem is geological and glaciological. Claims about an ancient ice-free Antarctic coast often blur enormous questions about when specific coastlines were exposed, what any observer could actually have seen, and whether the proposed timelines make sense at all. And above all, there is a methodological problem. Ambiguous shapes invite us to recognize patterns we already know. This is one of the oldest traps in interpretation. Once modern viewers carry Antarctica in their minds, the eye starts hunting for Antarctica in any large southern form. The same thing happens with faces in clouds, animals in constellations, or hidden messages in noise. Recognition feels like discovery, but feeling is not evidence. The brain is very good at rewarding itself for successful matching, even when the match depends on selective attention. That does not mean every resemblance is meaningless. It means resemblance has to be tested against simpler explanations. If one reading requires a distorted but entirely ordinary 16th century South American coast, and another requires a lost chain of ancient geographers preserving knowledge of an ice-free polar continent, historians are not being timid when they choose the first. They are following a basic rule of inquiry: prefer the explanation that demands the fewest unsupported assumptions. And in this case, the simpler explanations are not only simpler, they are historically grounded. We know early modern maps often combined first-hand observation with copied errors. We know coastlines could be extended beyond reliable reconnaissance. We know mapmakers inherited old ideas about southern lands, and sometimes gave visual form to possibilities that had not been firmly observed. We know distortion can make familiar places look alien, especially when fragments survive without the full original context. What we do not know is any verified chain of evidence that turns this particular coastline into a pre-modern record of Antarctica, much less an ice-free one. So the southern land on the Piri Reis map remains interesting, but interesting in a more disciplined way. It may preserve confusion at the threshold of discovery. It may show the strain of forcing multiple reports into one image. It may reveal how a skilled compiler handled uncertainty when certainty was impossible, and in that sense, it tells us something more historically valuable than a fantasy of vanished super-surveyors. It tells us what the edge of knowledge actually looked like: uneven, improvised, half-seen, built from fragments that did not yet know how to become a continent. And that, in its own way, is the deeper mystery. Not how ancient people secretly mapped Antarctica, but how generations of sailors, copyists, cosmographers, and compilers tried to draw a world that was still arriving in pieces. Because the more honestly we face the ambiguity of that southern coastline, the more the map stops being a miracle from outside history and becomes something stranger and perhaps more human from within it. And once a map acquires that kind of aura, The claims rarely stop at one coastline. If the Piri Reis fragment can be made to suggest Antarctica, then for some writers it can also suggest something larger. Traces of a lost civilization, evidence of advanced prehistoric navigation, or the shadow of secret archives preserving knowledge the rest of history forgot. This is where the map starts telling us not only about the 16th century, but about ourselves. Because the more ambiguous a document is, the easier it becomes to load it with modern longing. A broken map is especially vulnerable to that process. It survives in part, not whole. It contains real information, but also distortions, compressions, and unresolved joins. It comes with tantalizing notes about multiple sources. It emerged from a world of imperial rivalry, maritime secrecy, and incomplete disclosure. In other words, it offers just enough solidity to feel credible, and just enough uncertainty to feel expandable. That combination is irresistible. One line of speculation says the map preserves knowledge inherited from an unknown ancient seafaring culture, a civilization capable of charting distant coasts with astonishing precision long before the classical or medieval worlds. Another says the real key lies in hidden repositories, perhaps in Alexandria before its destruction, perhaps in Byzantine collections, perhaps in Ottoman or Vatican archives where older charts supposedly survived and were quietly folded into later mapmaking. Still another imagines a chain of transmission, so old and so sophisticated that the Piri Reis map becomes not an Ottoman compilation of recent discoveries and older charts, but the late echo of a vanished cartographic science. These ideas are dramatic. They are imaginative. They also reveal how quickly a possibility can harden into a narrative when gaps in the evidence are treated as invitations rather than warnings. To be clear, there is nothing irrational about asking whether older knowledge survived in unexpected ways. Of course it sometimes did. Ancient geographical ideas were copied, translated, abridged, lost, rediscovered, and repurposed across centuries. Nautical knowledge moved through merchants, pilots, prisoners, diplomats, and spies. Libraries were destroyed. But manuscripts also travelled, charts disappeared. But fragments of their information could persist in later works. No serious historian imagines the past as a neat chain, with every link intact and visible. So openness matters, but openness is not the same as surrender. The question is not whether transmission across time is possible in the abstract. The question is what this map actually demonstrates. And that answer has to begin with a distinction that is easy to blur. There is the map itself, and then there are the stories later readers tell about the map. The map itself is a 16th century Ottoman work compiled by Piri Reis from multiple sources, some contemporary, some older, some likely Iberian, some perhaps harder for us to identify precisely. The surviving fragment shows parts of the Atlantic world, including familiar sections of Europe, Africa, and the Americas, along with inscriptions that openly acknowledge compilation. It contains distortions we would expect in a map made from mixed materials. It preserves valuable evidence about what information was circulating and how a skilled compiler organized it. That much is grounded. Then come the inferences. A certain bend in a coast is said to prove access to a prehistoric original. A missing or misplaced feature is reinterpreted as deliberate encoding. A resemblance is promoted from suggestive to decisive. A note that mentions many sources becomes, by rhetorical expansion, a doorway to secret repositories no one can document. Before long, the argument is no longer resting on what is written or drawn, but on what someone believes must lie behind it. And that is a much more fragile kind of reasoning. The danger here is not curiosity. The danger is escalation. Once visual resemblance becomes enough, almost any old map can be made to predict almost anything. Once hidden archives are allowed to explain the absence of evidence, the lack of documentation stops being a problem, and starts being recast as part of the intrigue. Once a lost civilization is introduced as the ultimate source, every inconsistency can be blamed on centuries of copying, while every apparent success is treated as a surviving fragment of genius. But notice what has happened. The theory becomes hardest to test exactly where it becomes most ambitious. That is the opposite of how strong historical arguments usually work. Visual similarity by itself cannot do that work. This matters because maps are unusually seductive pieces of evidence. A text can be argued over line by line. A map strikes all at once. It gives the feeling of direct contact with reality. We look at a coastline and think we are seeing knowledge in its purest form, as if the line on the page had passed cleanly from landscape to chart. But that is not how maps are made. They are built through selection, translation, copying, compression, projection, expectation, and error. Two shapes can look similar for reasons that range from genuine relationship to coincidence to heavy modern reinterpretation. And when the match only appears after rotating, resizing, isolating one segment, ignoring another, and supplying a context the original maker never stated, confidence should decrease, not increase. This is what other controversies around the Piri Reis map really reveal. Not that the fragment has been solved by skeptics and foolishly mystified by everyone else, and not that every unconventional idea is automatically absurd. How much ambiguity are we willing to tolerate before we leap? How much missing evidence are we willing to excuse because the story is exciting? How often do we mistake the thrill of an answer for the strength of one? The Piri Reis map becomes a kind of test case. It attracts people who want history to be stranger than the textbooks say, and that impulse is not inherently bad. Sometimes the textbooks are incomplete. Sometimes accepted narratives do change. Genuine breakthroughs do happen because someone notices what others ignored. They have to be checked against provenance, chronology, context, transmission, comparison, and the mundane habits of the world that produced the object. They have to explain more than they assume. They have to remain convincing after the most dramatic wording is stripped away. And that is why the most responsible posture here is neither scoffing nor credulity. It is curiosity with breaks. Yes, ask whether older sources fed into the map in ways we cannot fully reconstruct. Yes, remain open to the possibility that some information travelled farther and lasted longer than our surviving records make obvious. Yes, admit that historical evidence is often patchy and that certainty can be harder to come by than confidence. But also ask the next question: what exactly is being claimed? What on the map supports it directly? What has to be added from outside? Which parts are documented, and which parts are imaginative scaffolding erected around an intriguing artifact? Those questions do not diminish the mystery. They protect it from becoming mythology. And if we keep that balance, open-eyed but unconvinced, the map remains what it has been all along. A remarkable object from a world where information moved unevenly, where fragments carried power, and where later generations would be tempted to see in those fragments exactly what they most wanted to find. Which, in a way, sets up the next chapter of the story perfectly. Because the modern fame of the Piri Reis map did not begin in 1513. It began when the fragment re-entered the world and met an audience already hungry for hidden history. It is one thing for a map to exist. It is another for it to be found at exactly the right moment, in 1929, during work connected with the reorganization of the museum collections at Topkapi Palace in Istanbul. A parchment map fragment came back into view. It had been resting inside the former Ottoman imperial palace, in a setting rich with manuscripts, objects of state, and the layered debris of an empire that had preserved more than later generations always realized. When scholars examined the fragment, the surprise was immediate. There is a quiet drama in discoveries like that. Not trumpets, Not a locked vault opening under torchlight, just a scholar, a cabinet, a fragment of parchment, and the sudden realization that a forgotten object has been waiting longer than any human life to be read again. This was not just any old chart. It bore the signature of Piri Reis, one of the best-known Ottoman mariners and authors of the early 16th century. It carried a date corresponding to 1513, and, most striking of all, it appeared to show parts of the Atlantic world at the very dawn of sustained European expansion into the Americas. That combination mattered. A map tied to a named Ottoman admiral was already important. A map from 1513 was more important still. But a 1513 Ottoman map that seemed to incorporate recent discoveries from both European and non-European channels touched several historical nerves at once. It suggested that knowledge of the newly encountered Western lands was moving across political and religious boundaries faster and more widely than many people had casually assumed. For specialists, that alone was enough to make the fragment extraordinary. The first reactions were not the reactions of sensational television or paperback conspiracy culture. They were the reactions of historians, philologists, and cartographic scholars trying to answer basic questions. What exactly was this object? Was the date authentic? Were the inscriptions consistent with Piri Reis's known work? How did the fragment relate to Ottoman mapmaking, to Porto land traditions, and to the early cartographic record of the Atlantic? What did the notes reveal about sources, and how much confidence could be placed in them? Those are not glamorous questions. They are better than glamorous questions, because they are the questions that turn an exciting find into historical evidence. Early academic work focused on transcription, comparison, and context. Scholars studied the Ottoman Turkish inscriptions, compared the hand and content to what was known from Piri Reis's career, and situated the map within the broader world of 16th century cartography. They did not treat it as a free-floating anomaly dropped from nowhere. They treated it as a document with a maker, a date, a language, and a historical environment. That process mattered enormously. It is easy later on to talk about the Piri Reis map as if it burst onto the modern stage already wrapped in mystery. In reality, one reason it became so significant is that scholars could anchor it. The date was not a modern fantasy attached to an anonymous sheet. The attribution to Piri Reis was not a purely speculative leap. The surviving fragment could be connected to a known historical figure who also wrote the Kitab-ı Bariye, the famous book of navigation, and who worked in an Ottoman maritime world deeply engaged with Mediterranean and Atlantic information flows. In other words, the map was surprising but not untethered. That distinction is easy to lose because once a remarkable artifact enters public awareness, the rediscovery itself starts acquiring drama. A forgotten map in an imperial palace, a hidden treasure of knowledge preserved for centuries, a document lost to the world until modern eyes finally recognized its true meaning. Every element in that story carries narrative charge, and narrative charge tends to expand. A scholar says the map was rediscovered in palace collections. A later retelling makes it sound as if the map had been deliberately concealed. An archival object turns into a suppressed secret. Normal gaps in cataloguing become evidence of intentional silence. The more astonishing the claims attached to the map become, the more the act of rediscovery is retold, not as routine scholarly recovery, but as revelation. This is one of the strange things that happens to historical objects in the modern age. Finding them is not enough. We also rewrite the finding. The 20th century was especially fertile ground for that transformation. As mass publishing expanded and later as radio magazines, documentaries, and popular history markets grew, specialist discoveries could migrate rapidly into wider culture. A map, once discussed mainly in academic circles, could become the subject of general fascination. And once it did, the incentives changed. Scholars usually ask how a document fits into the known world. Popular media often ask how a document breaks it. That shift does not always produce distortion, but it often invites it. The Piri Reis map was perfect material for the new cycle. It was old, rare, fragmentary, visually striking, connected to the age of discovery, and open enough in its details to support dramatic interpretation. It had just enough established fact to feel solid, and just enough ambiguity to feel explosive. Soon the map was no longer only an Ottoman chart from 1513. It was a mystery object, and mystery objects have a way of attracting each new generation's favourite anxieties and fantasies. In one era, the emphasis might fall on lost archives, in another, on forgotten voyages, in another, on hidden civilizations, advanced ancient science, or knowledge somehow excluded from official history. The map did not change, but the spotlight around it did. Media cycles amplified that effect. An academic article might cautiously note an unusual feature or an unresolved question. A popular retelling would smooth away the caution and sharpen the wonder. Then a later writer would cite the popular version rather than the careful one, and the claim would harden. Over time, repetition could make a weak inference feel ancient, familiar, and therefore true. This is how a specialist artifact becomes a global riddle. Not all at once, and not by fraud alone. More often by accumulation, by headlines that prefer the astonishing angle, by audiences already primed to believe that the most important truths have been hidden, by the seductive grammar of rediscovery itself, which implies not just that something was found, but that something important was missing, and perhaps kept from view. That last idea is especially powerful. If a map sat for centuries in Topkapi Palace before entering modern discussion, then for some people the delay itself feels suspicious. Why was it not known sooner? What else might be waiting in old collections? Who controlled access to such material? Did institutions fail to understand what they had, or did they understand it too well? Those questions can begin innocently. They do not always stay innocent. Very quickly, the romance of rediscovery can become the politics of hidden knowledge. The archive starts to look like a vault. The museum starts to look like a gatekeeper. Ordinary scholarly caution starts to look like denial. And the less most people know about how collections, manuscripts, and cataloguing actually work, the easier it becomes to turn delay into intrigue. But historical rediscovery is often messier and less theatrical than the myth suggests. Objects are misplaced in large collections. Descriptions are incomplete. Regimes change. Institutions reorganize. Languages become barriers. Material survives without being fully studied. And then suddenly, a fragment is recognized for what it is. Not because the world has been deceived, but because scholarship finally catches up with preservation. That may be less cinematic than a cover-up. It is also usually closer to reality. Still, once the modern spotlight found the Piri Reis map, it never really left. The fragment had crossed a threshold. It was now living two lives at once, one as a historical document to be studied in context, and another as a modern symbol of forbidden possibility. And those two lives would not always agree, which is exactly why the next question matters so much. When a map arrives, trailing wonder, suspicion, and decades of amplified retelling, how do scholars decide what it can actually bear? They begin by slowing everything down. That is the first discipline. Not rejecting the wonder, exactly, not pretending the object is ordinary, but refusing to let fascination do the measuring. A map like this is not evaluated by asking whether it feels impossible. It is evaluated by asking a chain of smaller, harder questions, each one anchored to material evidence, historical context, and comparison. In other words, scholars do not start with the mystery. They start with the object. What is the handwriting like? What language forms appear in the inscriptions? Are the letter shapes, spellings and phrasing consistent with early 16th century Ottoman usage? That is the work of paleography, and it matters more than it may sound. Handwriting is not just style, it carries habits, conventions, and dates hidden in plain sight. A text can announce itself as ancient and still betray a later hand. A note can claim one origin while the script suggests another. So the writing on the Piri Reis fragment is not background decoration, it is evidence. Then there is the material itself. Ink and parchment analysis do not usually produce a magical final answer, but they can narrow the field. What kind of skin was used? How was it prepared? Do the inks behave in ways consistent with the period? Are there later additions, restorations, or overdrawn lines that might complicate interpretation? Scholars look for the physical life of the artifact, because a map is never only an image. It is also an object made by hands, stored in places, exposed to damage, and altered by time. That physical scrutiny has an important effect. It pulls the conversation away from abstraction. People often discuss famous maps as if they were pure information, almost like a file that somehow floated unchanged across the centuries. But historical maps are handmade things. Their lines are uneven. Their texts can be cramped or corrected. Their surfaces can shrink, stretch, stain, or tear. Before anyone decides that a coastline is shockingly accurate or suspiciously wrong, they have to reckon with the fact that they are looking at a surviving fragment of a worked piece of parchment. And then comes comparison, not casual comparison, where one shape is laid over another until a resemblance appears, but comparative coastline study done with attention to projection, scale, copying habits, and the expectations of the period. Scholars ask which known coasts seem to have informed the drawing. They compare capes, bends, island placements, river mouths, and directional logic. They look not only for matches, but for families of resemblance. That distinction is crucial, because exact matches are rarer than people assume. They are rare even in maps made from good information. They are rarer still in compilations built from different sources, copied through multiple hands, and drawn onto a surface that was never intended to satisfy modern standards of geometric precision. A coastline on a 16th century chart is not a fingerprint. It is an interpretation. It reflects observation, hearsay, translation between map traditions, and the distortions introduced every time information is transferred from one form to another. So when someone says a section of the Piri Reis map matches a modern coastline exactly, scholars tend to get cautious very quickly. Usually exactly dissolves on contact with method. What appears exact at first glance may depend on rotating the image, cropping inconvenient portions, ignoring scale shifts, or privileging a few suggestive points while overlooking the rest. The closer the analysis becomes, the more uncertainty has to be admitted. This line may resemble that coast within a broad range. This island cluster may preserve real navigational knowledge, but not in a mathematically exact way. This feature may reflect a now lost source, or just as plausibly a common cartographic convention. That is not weakness. That is honest measurement. The textual notes matter just as much as the drawn lines. Piri Reis did not leave a silent image. He left inscriptions, claims about sources, comments about what was known, and hints about the chain by which information reached him. Scholars weigh those notes carefully. They do not accept every statement without question, but they do not dismiss them either. A compiler's note can preserve genuine memory about source materials. It can also compress, simplify, or elevate the status of those materials. So the annotations are treated as testimony, valuable, revealing, and not automatically self-proving. From all of this, a broad picture emerges. Some things are widely accepted. The surviving fragment is understood as an authentic early 16th century Ottoman map associated with Piri Reis. It is broadly seen as a compilation drawing on multiple sources, including material connected to Iberian exploration and older cartographic traditions. It is also widely recognized as remarkable not because it breaks the laws of history, but because it captures an unusually vivid moment when geographic knowledge was moving fast, crossing boundaries, and being reassembled in new imperial settings. Other things remain debated. Exactly which source maps lay behind particular sections, how directly any Colombian material may have reached Piri Reis, which distortions come from projection and which from copying, how certain southern features should be identified, whether some resemblances are genuinely significant or simply the kind of pattern the human eye is eager to find. That last problem never goes away. When a document is famous for mystery, resemblance becomes seductive. People want the line to be Antarctica, the note to be proof, the distortion to conceal precision. Scholars have to resist both extremes at once, the extreme that sees hidden perfection everywhere, and the extreme that waves away every puzzle as meaningless. The best historical judgment usually lives in the middle. The Piri Reis map is a remarkable compilation. It is also a limited fragment. It preserves real and important evidence about early 16th century mapping, source use, and the circulation of knowledge across worlds that are too often imagined as isolated. At the same time, it does not answer every question people have asked of it, and some of its edges remain unresolved, not because the truth is being hidden, but because fragments are fragmentary. They can feel unsatisfying. It is also the reason the map still matters. Because the real power of a mystery like this is not only in the possibility that something impossible happened, it is in what the mystery reveals about us. The Piri Reis map matters because it sits at the meeting point of ambition, rivalry, curiosity, memory, error, and imagination. It comes from a world where knowledge was valuable precisely because it was unevenly distributed. A coastline was not just a shape. It could mean trade, military advantage, prestige, danger avoided, wealth gained. It also captures a moment when the edges of the known world were still being argued into shape. New voyages did not simply add facts to a blank page. They collided with older authorities, sailor testimony, copied charts, hopeful guesses, and the limits of what any one person could verify. That is why artifacts like this hold us. They promise that the past is larger than the clean summaries we inherit. They whisper that something may have been missed, and sometimes, of course, something has been missed. But the map does not need to prove a lost civilization to remain extraordinary. Its deeper story is already human enough. Sailors crossing dangerous water, empires guarding secrets, prisoners and pilots carrying knowledge in their memories, and a mapmaker in Istanbul trying to turn all of it into one fragile image. That is where the wonder belongs, not in forcing every uncertain line to become a revelation, but in seeing how much history can survive inside a torn piece of parchment. So perhaps the most interesting questions left are quieter ones. What was lost between Piri's sources and the fragment we possess now? How much of the mystery belongs to the original map? And how much belongs to the damage, the gaps, and the centuries of interpretation layered on top of it? When we think we see a secret in the lines, are we recovering the past or reading ourselves into it? Those questions do not close the mystery. They sharpen it. What we can say with some confidence is enough to make the map remarkable even before any larger claims are added. We can say that the surviving Piri Reis fragment is a real early 16th century Ottoman work, compiled in a world where geographic knowledge was moving across languages, religions, and rival empires faster than we sometimes imagine. We can say that it reflects both skill and limitation, careful compilation, real access to valuable information, and the ordinary distortions that come from combining sources that were never perfectly aligned. We can say that Piri Reis was not drawing from nowhere. He was working within a living network of charts, reports, and inherited traditions, and we can say that this alone makes the map historically important. We can also say that some of the strongest modern myths ask the map to do too much. It is not necessary to turn it into proof of a lost ice-free Antarctica, or evidence of ancient global surveying, or a relic of some vanished super-civilization in order for it to matter. In fact, once those conclusions are treated as settled, the map often becomes less interesting, not more. The real story is more textured than that. A complicated artifact from a complicated age survived in damaged form, and then entered a modern world eager for secrets. That is already a powerful combination, and yet there are things we cannot say honestly. We cannot reconstruct every source that lay behind the map. We cannot know exactly what Piri Reis saw with our own eyes, because some of those materials are lost. We cannot always separate with precision what came from direct nautical knowledge, what came from copied charts, what came from older geographic habits, and what came from inference or misunderstanding. We cannot force every coastline into a neat one-to-one identification, and we cannot pretend that resemblance alone is proof. That last point matters. Human beings are very good at seeing patterns, especially when a shape seems almost to fit. A bent coastline, a stretched peninsula, a compressed southern landmass. These can feel persuasive when placed beside a modern map, but feeling persuasive and being demonstrable are not the same thing. Historical interpretation asks for more than a visual echo. It asks for context, transmission, comparison, and restraint. So the honest position is not that the mystery disappears. It is that the mystery changes shape. Instead of asking whether the map overturns history, we ask what it reveals about how history was actually made. Instead of searching for one sensational answer, we allow for overlapping explanations, partial information, damaged survival, ambitious compilation, uneven source quality, and centuries of interpretation laid over the top. That approach may sound less dramatic at first, but in the long run it is far more satisfying, because it respects both the artifact and the past it came from, and perhaps that is the best place to leave the map. Not solved into dullness, not inflated into fantasy, but held where it belongs, in that difficult and beautiful space between knowledge and uncertainty. A place where wonder is still allowed, a place where evidence still matters, a place where the past remains larger than any single theory we try to press onto it. If this story has stayed with you, and if you enjoy exploring old mysteries with patience, atmosphere, and a little healthy doubt, then I'd love to ask you to like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe to Kingdoms at Night. It genuinely helps the channel grow, and it helps more people find these long, calm journeys into history. And if you do leave a comment, tell me where you're listening from. I always love seeing how far these stories travel, and how many different corners of the world gather around the same question. Because in the end, the Piri Reis map is not valuable only for the answers it gives. It is valuable for the standard it invites us to keep, to stay curious without becoming careless, to remain open without surrendering judgment, to let old objects surprise us, but not command us into belief before the evidence is ready. That is a difficult balance, but it is one of the deepest pleasures history offers. The past does not owe us certainty. Sometimes it gives us fragments instead, a note in the margin, a torn edge of parchment, a name attached to a claim, a coastline that almost matches but not quite, a silence where we wish there were records, a survival so improbable that centuries later we are still leaning closer, trying to understand what, exactly, we are looking at. And maybe that is enough. Not because uncertainty is comfortable, but because it is honest. The Piri Reis map does not need to be impossible to be extraordinary. It only needs to be what it is, a surviving piece of human effort assembled from a world in motion, carrying traces of knowledge, confusion, ambition, and loss. The more carefully we look at it, the more it reminds us that history is not a vault of perfect answers waiting to be opened. It is a conversation, one we inherit, one we revise, and one we continue line by line, as long as we are willing to look closely, ask carefully, and live with the possibility that the truest conclusion is not the loudest one, but the most earned.